In the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to valleys abandoned by time, a documented case has puzzled historians for nearly 2 centuries. In 1834, Reverend Ezekiel Morrison arrived at the remote Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow with his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, a settlement so isolated that maps of the era barely noted its existence. What occurred during their 3-day stay was carefully recorded in Pastor William Phillips' personal journal, discovered in 1987, when the old church was demolished. The entries describe events with such precision that modern psychologists have studied them extensively. Yet none can explain how 2 young children possessed knowledge defying every rational explanation. The Morrison twins did not merely predict future events. They revealed long-buried secrets, described strangers they had never met, and spoke of tragedies that occurred before their birth. Most unsettling, every detail they disclosed proved to be completely true. This channel is not for everyone, only for those willing to confront mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality. Before diving deeper into the Morrison case, subscribe, as we are about to uncover details most historians avoid. And tell us in the comments which state you are listening from, because what happened in Kentucky may have occurred closer to home than you think. The story begins not with the supernatural, but with something more disquieting. The possibility that some human minds can access information in ways science cannot yet explain. Kentucky in 1834 was a land between wilderness and civilization, where communities like Pine Hollow existed in virtual isolation among the Cumberland foothills. Established in 1818 by 3 families seeking religious freedom, Pine Hollow had grown to barely 200 residents by the time the Morrisons arrived, most related by blood or marriage, all bound by strict Baptist doctrine. The community centered around a modest wooden church, built with timber from the surrounding hills. Pastor William Phillips, a learned man who had left a comfortable life in Lexington to serve these frontier settlers, kept the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and other significant events. His meticulous nature proved crucial in documenting what was about to unfold. Ezekiel Morrison was a familiar figure along the circuit of remote Appalachian churches. Tall and weathered, with prematurely gray hair reflecting hardships beyond his 34 years, he traveled on foot with his daughters, carrying only a worn leather satchel containing his Bible, a few personal items, and a journal for his spiritual observations. Widowed for 9 years after his wife Sarah died giving birth to the twins during a harsh winter storm, Ezekiel was a solitary figure with a strong sense of purpose. The twins Rebecca and Rachel were identical in appearance but differed in temperament. Rebecca, born first, was outgoing and magnetic, with a smile and laugh that drew people in and a confidence beyond her years. Rachel, quieter and observant, often existed in her sister's shadow. Yet careful observers noticed that Rachel frequently began sentences her sister finished, or answered questions directed at Rebecca before she could respond. The Morrison family was notable among circuit preachers for Ezekiel's reputation for bringing spiritual renewal to struggling congregations. Stories followed them from church to church, backsliders returning to faith, communities resolving long-standing conflicts, and spiritual awakenings lasting years after their departure. While some attributed this to Ezekiel's passionate preaching, others noticed that the true changes often began after private conversations with the twins. The journey to Pine Hollow had been especially difficult. Late autumn rains had turned mountain paths into treacherous mud, and Ezekiel carried Rachel for the final 5 miles when she developed a fever. They arrived at sunset on November 15, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips concluded evening prayers with the few congregants attending weeknight services. Phillips later wrote that his first impression of the family was one of profound weariness, both physical and spiritual. Ezekiel's clothes were worn and patched, his boots thin from countless miles. The girls clung to their father, Rachel still pale from her fever, Rebecca's usual brightness dimmed by exhaustion. Yet something in their eyes, an alertness and awareness unusual for their age, left Phillips inexplicably uneasy. Pine Hollow had hosted many traveling preachers, but the Morrisons were different from the start. That first evening, during a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked Mrs. Phillips about her garden, specifically whether the roses by the eastern fence had recovered from the blight that had nearly killed them 3 summers prior. Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon, staring at the child in amazement. The rose blight had indeed struck 3 years earlier, devastating Mrs. Phillips' prized garden, yet she had never mentioned it to anyone outside the immediate community. When pressed, Rebecca simply smiled and said she had dreamed of roses while walking and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips grew the finest in the county. This entry, recorded in Pastor Phillips' journal that very evening, would prove to be just the first of many incidents that would challenge everything the Pine Hollow community believed about the natural world. The following morning dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind rattling the windows of the small cabin where the Morrisons had been given shelter. Pastor Phillips rose early, as was his custom, to prepare for the day's sermon. He found Ezekiel already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, Bible open, yet eyes staring into the distance with deep concern. They had disturbing dreams last night. Ezekiel explained when Phillips inquired about his troubled expression. They often dream of the places we will visit, but these dreams were different, darker. Before Phillips could respond, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled from sleep, but her eyes sharp and focused. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice, "beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar in your church, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it, and I dreamed why it's hidden." A chill ran through Phillips that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. Beneath those exact floorboards, he had hidden a bottle of whiskey, a symbol of his ongoing struggle with temptation. Not a soul knew of it. He had placed it there 3 months earlier, during a moment of weakness, telling himself it was better to resist daily than remove the temptation entirely. It was a secret he had shared only with God in private prayers. "What exactly did you dream, child?" Phillips asked, his voice barely steady. Rachel stepped from the shadows behind her sister, moving with the silent grace that characterized her every action. "The bottle is brown," she said softly, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket." A blue blanket. Phillips sank into his chair, unable to support his own weight. The cloth was indeed a remnant of a baby blanket, the same blanket that would have belonged to the son he and his wife lost in infancy 5 years earlier. He had wrapped the bottle in it, as a reminder of his failures, as a father who could not save his child, and as a pastor who could not conquer his own weaknesses. Ezekiel observed the pastor's reaction with a mixture of sympathy and wary familiarity. "It started when they were very young," he explained quietly. "At first, I thought it was mere childish intuition, the way children sometimes sense what adults miss. But as they grew, their insights became more specific, more impossible to explain naturally." That Sunday service would be remembered by the Pine Hollow congregation for the rest of their lives. Ezekiel's sermon was passionate, calling for spiritual renewal and confession of sins, yet it was what followed that defied rational explanation. As the congregation began to leave, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a prosperous farmer known for his generosity to the church. Looking up at him with innocent blue eyes, she said, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the collection isn't really stealing if you put it back, is it? Papa says God forgives those who repent." Turner's face drained of color. For 6 months, he had been skimming small amounts from the collection plate to cover debts from a failed investment in Louisville. He had planned to return the money once his finances improved, but the missing funds had eaten at his conscience. Before Turner could respond, Rachel stepped beside her sister and addressed Martha Whitfield, the elderly widow who acted as the church's moral authority. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband didn't die in the farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere, and that's why you hide the letters." The widow swayed, nearly fainting. Her husband had abandoned her and their children 15 years earlier, taking their savings and disappearing. She had fabricated the story of his death to protect her dignity and her children's future. The letters Rachel mentioned were correspondence she occasionally received from him, never shared with anyone. One by one, the twins quietly moved through the congregation, revealing secrets with startling accuracy to Dr. Hayes, patients who had died due to his lack of training, to the Miller family, a son hidden in their attic, to young Thomas Brett, secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, a married woman whose husband traveled frequently. Each revelation was delivered with childlike innocence, without judgment or malice, yet the precision of their statements left the congregation frozen in awe and fear. Pastor Phillips watched in horrified fascination as his orderly community was upended by 2 9-year-old children revealing truths that should have been known only to God. Yet it was Rebecca's final statement that haunted him most. She approached the altar, placed her small hand on the wooden cross carved by the church's founders, and said, "This is sacred ground, but it's been stained by what happened here before. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died right here in this very room. And some of you know exactly why." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself awaited a response to this impossible accusation. The revelation about the Whitman family hit the congregation like a physical blow. Pastor Phillips, pale as morning frost, gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles turned white. The Whitman tragedy was Pine Hollow's deepest secret, a wound never fully healed despite 16 years of collective silence. In 1818, when Pine Hollow was still a struggling settlement of barely 50 souls, the Whitmans had been among its most prominent members. Jacob Whitman served as both blacksmith and unofficial leader, while his wife Mary was known for her skill with herbal remedies and her gentle care during difficult births. Their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, had been the community's darlings, bright, beautiful 9-year-olds who sang in the church choir and helped their mother tend the sick. The official story, preserved in the meticulous records of Pastor Phillips' predecessors, stated that the Whitmans had perished in a tragic house fire during a winter storm. Their bodies were found in the remains of their home and interred in the church cemetery with ceremony. The community mourned, rebuilt, and moved forward as frontier settlements were forced to do when tragedy struck. But Rebecca's words suggested a very different reality, one that some of the older congregation members had hoped would remain buried forever. Elder Thompson, now 73 and one of Pine Hollow's founding families, rose slowly from his pew. His arthritis made movement painful, yet when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "Child," he said, measured and careful, "you speak of things that happened before you were born, in places you've never been. How could you possibly know what you claim to know?" Rebecca turned to him, her blue eyes holding an unsettling maturity. "Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder," she said quietly. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll their father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair. When they died, Faith was in her blue Sunday dress, and Hope was in her nightgown, because she had been ill with a fever. The congregation murmured in recognition. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "The night they died," Rachel continued, her voice soft but clear, "it wasn't a house fire. They came to the church seeking sanctuary because someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found anyway." The church was silent, so quiet that even the sound of breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Pastor Phillips remembered fragments of conversations from years past, whispered words that stopped when he entered the room, meaningful glances among older members, and the unmarked graves where families quietly left flowers. Samuel Turner, still shaken by the earlier revelation about his theft, stood abruptly. "This is madness," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "These children are making up stories to frighten us. There's no way they could know such things." Yet as he spoke, other details emerged from the congregation. Mrs. Carter whispered about bloodstains that had appeared on the church floor years ago, stains that no scrubbing could remove. Benjamin Foster recalled strange sounds echoing through the church late at night, dismissed as wind through loose boards. Dr. Hayes, despite his earlier embarrassment over his medical training, spoke with careful precision. "I've always wondered about the church's foundation. When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we found what looked like bone fragments mixed in with the original mortar. The implications hung heavily in the air. If the Whitman family had indeed died in the church, secretly interred within its very walls, then every service, prayer, and moment of worship had taken place over their unmarked graves. Ezekiel Morrison had stood silently throughout the revelations, his weathered face showing concern but no surprise. He had witnessed similar scenes in other communities, watching as his daughter's impossible knowledge unraveled carefully maintained lies and brought buried truths to light. "Mr. Morrison," Pastor Phillips said, his voice strained, "how do your daughters know these things? What gift allows such insight?" Ezekiel studied the congregation before speaking. "I've asked myself that every day for years," he said finally. Their mother, Sarah, claimed to have second sight, the ability to sense things beyond normal perception. But what the girls experience goes far beyond anything she ever demonstrated. They dream of places they've never seen, speak of people they've never met, and recall events that occurred before their birth. He paused, looking at his daughters with a mixture of love and profound sadness. "At first, I believed it was a blessing, a divine gift to help me minister to troubled souls. But over the years, I've begun to wonder if it is something else entirely. The knowledge they possess comes with a cost. They carry the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's pain. They knew things no children should ever have to know." As if summoned by their father's words, the twins moved to the front of the church, standing side by side. For the first time since their arrival, they looked like the children they truly were: small, vulnerable, and overwhelmed by the adult world swirling around them. "We don't choose what we see," Rebecca said, her earlier confidence replaced by a wariness far beyond her years. "The dreams come whether we want them or not. We see what was, what is, and sometimes what will be." Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "The Whitman sisters visit our dreams sometimes. They want people to know what really happened to them. They want someone to remember them properly." The church fell silent again, but this time it was a silence born of grappling with concepts that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of reality. Some faces showed skepticism, others fear, and still others a tentative hope that perhaps death was not the final ending they had always believed it to be. Pastor Phillips felt himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his ministry. He could dismiss the twins' claims as childish fantasy or deliberate deception, preserving the community's fragile stability. Or he could pursue the truth, no matter where it led, and risk shattering everything upon which Pine Hollow had been built. The consequences of that choice were unimaginable. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the settlement's narrow streets, Pastor Phillips found he could not concentrate on his usual prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him to his core, not just because of their accuracy, but because they forced him to confront questions he had long avoided. He had arrived in Pine Hollow 5 years earlier, eager to serve God in the wilderness and escape the theological disputes plaguing larger towns in Kentucky. His predecessor, Pastor Macabre Hayes, had left meticulous records of births, deaths, and significant events, but Phillips had always noticed gaps in the earliest documentation. The winter of 1818, in particular, seemed oddly sparse. Entries mentioned harsh weather, supply shortages, and the deaths of several elderly residents, but the tragedy of the Whitman family was noted only briefly. Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, were recorded as having perished in a house fire on December 21st. Their remains had been buried with proper ceremony, yet the lack of detail about such a significant event had always struck Phillips as strange, especially given Hayes' reputation for thorough record keeping. Determined to understand what the Morrison twins might have uncovered, Phillips searched through the church-stored records, buried beneath years of accumulated documents. He discovered a small leather journal he had never seen before. Its pages were fragile and water-stained, but the handwriting was unmistakably Pastor Hayes. What Phillips read by candlelight that night would forever change his understanding of Pine Hollow's history. The journal revealed that Hayes had been deeply troubled by the circumstances surrounding the Whitman family's death. According to his private notes, Jacob Whitman had uncovered something disturbing about certain community members, something so significant he demanded a public confession and restitution. The exact nature of the discovery was unclear, but Hayes' entries suggested financial impropriety, and perhaps worse. On the night of December 20, 1818, Jacob Whitman had confronted several community leaders in a heated meeting lasting well past midnight. Hayes recorded raised voices, accusations of theft and corruption, and threats of exposure that could ruin some of Pine Hollow's most respected families. The final entry, dated December 22nd, was particularly chilling. "The Lord forgive us all for what was done." Jacob and his family came to the church seeking sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying, then silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted we must protect the community's future, that the truth would destroy us all. I agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Philip set the journal down with trembling hands. The implications were staggering. The Whitman family had not died in a house fire at all. They had been murdered inside the church, and community leaders had conspired to cover it up. But how could the Morrison twins know details hidden for 16 years? How could they describe the children's clothing, belongings, and physical traits with such precision? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Opening it, he saw Rebecca standing in the moonlight. Her simple dress was neat, and her hair braided, as if she had been awake, preparing for something important. "Pastor Phillips," Rebecca said in her clear, childish voice, "you found Pastor Hayes' journal, didn't you? The one he hid behind the loose stone in the foundation?" Philip stared at her in astonishment. He had indeed discovered the journal in exactly that spot, guided by a subtle draft that had led him to the loose stone. "How did you know where to tell me to look?" he asked. "Faith showed me in a dream," Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. "Pastor Hayes was a good man who was forced to do bad things. She wanted someone to know the truth." The casual way she spoke of guidance from a long, dead child sent chills down Phillips's spine. "Rebecca," he asked carefully, "what exactly do you see when you have these dreams?" Her expression grew serious, and for a moment, Phillips glimpsed the burden she carried. "We see everything," she said simply. "Not just what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Whitman family didn't plan to harm anyone. They just wanted Jacob to stay quiet about what he discovered." "What had he discovered?" Phillips asked. Rebecca looked past him into the cabin, where Rachel sat by the window, staring out at the church cemetery. "The money for the church building didn't come from donations," Rebecca explained. "Some of it was stolen from travelers passing through the valley. Jacob discovered this when he was asked to make horseshoes for the horses of men who were already dead." The pieces began to fall into place for Phillips. The early years of Pine Hollow had been marked by frequent reports of travelers disappearing along the mountain paths. Officially, these disappearances were attributed to natural dangers: bears, falls, exposure to harsh weather. But if Jacob Whitman had uncovered evidence that some travelers were deliberately murdered and robbed, then the church had been built with blood money. That's why faith and hope can't rest. Rebecca continued, her young voice carrying a weight far beyond her years. Their blood was spilled on ground that was already cursed. Phillips found himself face to face with a truth more horrifying than anything he had imagined. The church he had devoted his life to, the sanctuary where he had prayed for guidance and comfort, had been constructed with the proceeds of murder, and had itself become the site of even greater violence. Even as he grappled with these revelations, a part of his mind remained analytical. How could he verify any of this? How could he distinguish between supernatural knowledge and an elaborate deception? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and from a source that would challenge every rational explanation he might construct. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Hollow. As the Morrison family prepared for their departure, having already extended their planned 3-day stay to accommodate Sunday's dramatic events, a lone horseman approached the settlement from the eastern trail. The rider was a man in his 50s, well dressed in the style of townfolk, with a bearing that suggested education and authority. He introduced himself to Pastor Phillips as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington searching for information about Pine Hollow's early years. "I represent the estate of one Marcus Webb," Brennan explained as he accepted Phillips's hospitality. Mr. Webb recently died in Louisville, and among his effects we found documents indicating business dealings with this community during its founding years. I am attempting to trace the disposition of certain funds that may have been irregularly transferred. Phillips felt his blood run cold. Marcus Webb's name had appeared in Pastor Hayes's secret journal, one of several travelers who disappeared along the mountain paths in 1818 and 1819. According to Hayes's notes, Webb had been carrying a considerable sum of money intended for land purchases in Tennessee. Before Phillips could respond, Rebecca appeared at his elbow, as if summoned by some unseen timing that characterized her appearances. She looked up at Brennan with curious eyes. "Mr. Webb had a gold watch with his initials engraved inside the cover," she said. "It had a crack across the crystal, because he dropped it when he fell from his horse." Brennan's composure cracked visibly. "How could you possibly know about Marcus Webb's watch?" he demanded. That detail had been mentioned only in his personal correspondence with his brother. Rachel materialized beside her sister, as if summoned by the same invisible signal. "The watch is buried behind the church," she said quietly, "along with his money bag and his horse's bridle. Elder Thompson put them there after what happened on the trail." The implications struck Phillips like a physical blow. If the twins were correct, Marcus Webb's personal effects were indeed buried behind the church. Their knowledge extended far beyond anything a normal child could possess, and it promised tangible evidence of the crimes that had financed Pine Hollow's early development. Brennan dismounted with urgency. "We must excavate immediately," he declared. "If what these children claim is true, we are looking at evidence of robbery and murder." Elder Thompson, observing from a distance, approached with visible reluctance. At 73, he was the only surviving member of the original leadership council that had made those early decisions. His weathered face bore a mixture of resignation and defiance. "You speak of things you don't understand, stranger," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of age and long experience. "This community was built by God, fearing people who did what they had to survive in the wilderness. Survival doesn't justify murder," Brennan replied sharply. "If these allegations are true, this entire settlement was founded on criminal acts." Rebecca lifted her gaze to Elder Thompson, her unsettling blue eyes holding him in place. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "the nightmares stopped coming after the first year, didn't they? You told yourself that meant God had forgiven you." Thompson's fat head crumbled. "Child," he whispered, "you couldn't possibly know. No one knows about the dreams where Marcus Webb begged you to let him go." Rachel continued, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "about how you see his face every night before you fall asleep." The old man sank onto a nearby tree stump, as if his legs could no longer support him. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, voice breaking. "We only meant to take the money. We were starving. Our children were sick, and winter was coming, but Webb fought back." Pastor Phillips felt the weight of the moment. He was witnessing the unraveling of everything he had believed about his community, his church, and his faith. Ezekiel Morrison, who had stood silently through the revelations, finally spoke. "The truth has a way of surfacing," he said quietly. "My daughters do not choose what they reveal. They are simply conduits for information that demands to be heard." Brennan wasted no time organizing an excavation. Within hours, several men from the community were digging behind the church, following the twins' precise directions. Phillips watched with growing dread, knowing that each shovel full of earth brought them closer to evidence that would shatter Pine Hollow's carefully constructed mythology. They didn't have to dig deep. 3 feet below the surface, their shovels struck something metallic. Carefully brushing away the soil, they uncovered a tarnished gold pocket watch. Its crystal was cracked, just as Rebecca had described, and the initials MW were clearly engraved inside the cover. Beside the watch lay a leather money bag, its contents long deteriorated but unmistakably present. The horse's bridle, though rotted, was still recognizable. Brennan examined the items with methodical precision. "This watch matches the description in Marcus Webb's correspondence exactly," he announced. "The crack across the crystal, the engraving, even the unusual chain link. Everything is precisely as his brother described it. But it was Elder Thompson's reaction that confirmed the truth most damningly. The old man stared at the recovered items as if seeing ghosts, lips moving in what might have been prayer or confession. There were others, he murmured. Webb wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. The trail through these mountains was perfect for what we needed to do. Travelers came regularly, often alone, carrying money for land deals or business ventures. The scope of the crimes became horrifyingly clear. Pine Hollow had not been built through hard work and divine providence. It had been financed through a systematic campaign of robbery and murder that lasted for years. Even as the evidence mounted, Phillips wrestled with questions that transcended the immediate crimes. How could the Morrison twins know details no living person should possess? How could they describe victims they had never met, crimes committed before their birth, and the locations of evidence hidden for decades? The answers threatened to shatter every rational explanation he had ever held, forcing him to confront the possibility that death was not the ending he had always believed it to be. As the sun set over Pine Hollow, casting long shadows across the excavation site and the cemetery beyond, Phillips realized his community stood at a crossroads. After 16 years of concealment, the truth was finally emerging, but it came with questions that challenged everything they had been taught to believe about justice, redemption, and the nature of reality itself. The Morrison twins stood together in the growing darkness, small figures silhouetted against the church that had been built with blood money and consecrated with innocent blood. They seemed to listen to something only they could hear, their gaze fixed on the cemetery, where so many secrets lay buried. Tomorrow would bring reckoning, but tonight belonged to the dead, finally speaking through 2 9-year-old children who possessed knowledge that defied every rational explanation. Dawn broke gray and cold over Pine Hollow, bringing a delegation of officials from the county seat. Word of the previous day's discoveries had traveled fast, and Solicitor Brennan had wasted no time contacting the authorities. By mid-morning, the settlement was host to a county sheriff, a territorial judge, and 2 federal marshals investigating the long-standing disappearances along the mountain trails. Judge Harrison, a stern man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes, established a temporary court in the church itself, a grimly appropriate choice given the building's bloody history. The entire community was summoned to witness what would serve as both hearing and reckoning. Elder Thompson, visibly weakened under the weight of his confessions, sat in the front pew, flanked by 2 other surviving members of the original leadership council. Their faces bore the hollow look of men who had carried terrible secrets for far too long. Yet it was the Morrison twins who commanded the most attention. Judge Harrison had been skeptical at first. How could 2 children possess knowledge beyond human understanding? But the revelations of the previous day left him no choice but to reconsider. He spent the morning interviewing them separately, trying to determine how they could possibly know the details of crimes that predated their births. Rebecca Morrison, Judge Harrison said, his voice echoing in the wooden church. Please tell this court how you know the location of Marcus Webb's personal effects. Rebecca stood in the witness area, looking impossibly small under the weight of adult attention. Faith Whitman told me in a dream, she said simply. She said the men who killed her family were the same ones who killed the travelers. She wanted everyone to know the truth. And you, Rachel Morrison? The judge pressed. How do you know details about events that occurred years before your birth? Rachel's voice was soft but clear. The dreams come to both of us. We see what happened as if we were there. We see the fear in people's eyes. We hear their last words. We feel their pain. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Are you claiming to communicate with the spirits of the dead? Ezekiel Morrison rose from his seat. Your Honor, my daughters have never claimed to understand their abilities. They simply report what they experience. I have witnessed them provide accurate information about dozens of communities we've visited, information they could not have obtained through ordinary means. Sheriff Mackenzie, a man more concerned with evidence than the supernatural, addressed the twins directly. Can you tell us how many people were killed along these mountain trails? Rebecca and Rachel exchanged one of their familiar, knowing glances. 11 men over 3 years, Rebecca answered. Most were traveling alone, carrying money for land purchases or business ventures. One was a preacher like Papa, but he carried gold coins sewn into his saddle. The specificity of her statement sent murmurs through the crowd. Rachel continued seamlessly. The preacher's name was Samuel Collins. He was planning to establish a new church in Tennessee. His horse was a bay mare with a white star on her forehead. Sheriff Mackenzie checked a worn notebook he had retrieved from his coat. His face paled. Samuel Collins disappeared along this route in September 1819. He confirmed. The description of his horse matches our records exactly. But it was what happened next that shook everyone present to their core. Elder Thompson, hands trembling with age and guilt, struggled to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, voice cracking, "I can bear this burden no longer. What these children say is true, every word of it. But there is something else, something worse than the murders we committed." The church fell silent, except for the sound of wind through loose boards and the distant cry of a hawk. The Whitman family. Thompson continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. They didn't just stumble upon evidence of our crimes. Jacob Whitman was my brother-in-law. I confided in him about what we were doing, thinking family loyalty would keep him quiet. But Jacob had a conscience stronger than his loyalty. Pastor Phillips felt the world tilting as Thompson's confession unfolded. Jacob threatened to expose us unless we made restitution to the families of the dead. He said he would ride to Lexington himself and report our crimes to the territorial authorities. We couldn't let that happen. Too many families depended on what we had built here. Thompson's voice dropped to a whisper. On the night of December 21st, 1818, we followed the Whitman family to the church. Jacob had brought Mary and the twins there, thinking sacred ground would protect them. But we were desperate men with everything to lose. Rebecca grew still, her young face pale but resolute. "Tell them about the babies," she said quietly. Thompson's composure shattered completely. "Dear God," he sobbed, "how could you know about the babies?" "Judge." Harrison leaned forward, eyes intense. "What babies?" "Explain yourself, man." "Mary Whitman was with child when we killed her," Thompson said, words tearing from his throat. 8 months along twins. The doctor said they might have lived if we had gotten help instead of. He could not finish. Rachel stepped forward, voice carrying over the stunned silence. "That's why we can see everything so clearly. Faith and Hope Whitman weren't the only children who died that night. Their unborn sisters died with them. 4 souls crying out for justice." The theological implications reverberated through the crowd. If the twins were somehow channeling the spirits of the deceased Whitman children, including the unborn, it suggested a knowledge of the afterlife that challenged fundamental Christian doctrine. Dr. Hayes, the community's unofficial physician, found his voice. "I assisted with the burial," he said slowly. "We found evidence of the pregnancy, but we told ourselves the babies were too young to have souls, that they wouldn't need proper burial rites. Every soul matters to God." Ezekiel Morrison said firmly. "Every life, no matter how brief, has eternal significance." But Judge Harrison was focused on earthly justice. "Mr. Thompson, are you confessing to the murder of Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, their twin daughters, and 2 unborn children?" "I am," Thompson replied, voice hollow with despair. "And to the murders of 11 travelers who trusted us with their lives. We are all guilty, myself, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry. We planned it, carried it out, and hid it together for 16 years. The 2 other elderly men Thompson named sat in stunned silence, faces masks of resignation and terror. 16 years of collective guilt had finally grown too heavy to bear. Sheriff Mackenzie rose, beginning to place the men under arrest, but Judge Harrison held up a hand. "Before we proceed with formal charges," he said, "I need to understand how these children could possibly know details that were never recorded, never spoken, never shared outside the circle of perpetrators." Rebecca looked up at the judge with those unnaturally knowing blue eyes. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and firm, "some truths are too big to stay buried forever. The Whitman sisters and their unborn babies have been waiting 16 years for someone to hear their story. How do you hear them?" the judge asked. What mechanism allows this communication? Rachel joined her sister at the front of the church. We don't understand it any more than you do, she said. Ever since we were very small, we've had dreams about places we've never been and people we've never met. Papa says our mama had the gift of second sight, but what we experience is different. Different how? The judge pressed. Rebecca and Rachel exchanged one of their meaningful glances. Rebecca answered, Mama could sense things about living people, their emotions, intentions, hidden thoughts. But we see beyond that. We see the echoes that tragedy leaves behind, especially when innocent blood is spilled. Ezekiel Morrison, listening with growing concern, spoke. Your Honor, I've spent years trying to understand my daughter's abilities. I've consulted ministers, doctors, and scholars throughout Kentucky and Tennessee. None can explain it, but all have witnessed its accuracy. Judge Harrison was silent for a long moment, studying the twins with a mixture of fascination and unease. Finally, he asked, Miss Rebecca, Miss Rachel, if you truly possess this gift, perhaps you can tell us where the bodies of the other victims were disposed of. The question hung in the air like heavy smoke. If the twins could locate the remains of Marcus Webb and the other murdered travelers, it would provide the final proof needed to close cases that had baffled authorities for years. Rebecca closed her eyes, listening to something only she could hear. Some are in the old mine shaft east of town, she said after a pause. Others were thrown into Devil's Creek, where the current runs deepest. But 3 were buried beneath the church floor, their bones mixed with the foundation stones. The revelation that 3 murder victims lay beneath the church sent a shudder through the congregation. Pastor Phillips realized with horror that he had been conducting services, celebrating communion, and offering prayers for salvation while standing directly above unmarked graves. Sheriff Mackenzie looked to Judge Harrison. Your Honor, if we are to verify these claims, we'll need to excavate the church floor itself. And we will, the judge replied grimly. But first, I want to understand the full scope of these crimes. He turned to Elder Thompson. Where is the money stolen from these victims? What was done with their possessions? Thompson gestured weakly toward the church. Everything went into building our community, the church, the school, the mills. All of it was built with blood money. We told ourselves we were creating something good from something evil, that God would forgive us if we used the money for righteous purposes. And the victims' families? Judge Harrison asked. Did you consider the wives, children, parents who never learned what happened to their loved ones? It was Rachel who answered, her young voice heavy with sadness. Marcus Webb had a wife named Elizabeth and 2 young sons. Samuel Collins was engaged to a woman named Catherine, who waited for him until she died of consumption 3 years later. Most of the others had families who spent years wondering, hoping, grieving without closure. The specificity of her knowledge, the names, the relationships, the personal losses, was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire ordeal. These were not just historical facts. The twins spoke of the murdered men as if they had known them, personally, as if they bore the weight of their unfulfilled dreams and abandoned responsibilities. Judge Harrison rose and addressed the assembled crowd, his voice steady despite the weight of the revelations. This court will recess while we conduct a thorough investigation of the claims made here today. Judge Harrison declared, Sheriff Mackenzie will coordinate the excavation of the church floor and the search of the locations identified by the Morrison children. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will remain in custody pending formal charges. As the 3 elderly men were led away in shackles, the congregation dispersed in stunned silence. 16 years of carefully maintained lies had collapsed in a single morning, leaving the community to confront the horrifying truth. Their foundation had been built on murder and deceit. For Pastor Phillips, the most disturbing questions lingered. How could 2 9-year-old children possess knowledge that defied every natural law? What did their abilities suggest about death? The persistence of consciousness, and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead. The Morrison twins stood together in the empty church, their small frames dwarfed by the weight of their revelations. Exhaustion marked their features, the toll of channeling so much pain and injustice evident. "Papa?" Rebecca whispered. "Can we leave now? The voices, they're getting louder, and it's hard to keep them all straight." Ezekiel Morrison gathered his daughters close, his weathered face etched with concern. "Soon," he promised. "But first, we must help these people understand what you've shown them." As the sun rose high over Pine Hollow, casting sharp shadows across the church cemetery and the excavation site, the community braced for revelations that would challenge everything they had believed about justice, redemption, and the consequences of earthly actions. The truth was emerging from 16 years of darkness, but it came with questions that would haunt every witness for the rest of their lives. The excavation of the church floor took 3 days. Working methodically under Judge Harrison's supervision, Sheriff Mackenzie's team removed the wooden planks and began carefully digging through the packed earth beneath. What they uncovered confirmed the Morrison twins' claims with chilling precision. 3 complete skeletons lay beneath the sanctuary, their bones intertwined with the foundation stones exactly as Rebecca had described. Personal effects found with the remains matched long missing persons reports from 1818 and 1819. A gold ring engraved with the initials JP belonged to Joshua Patterson, a land surveyor who had vanished while mapping territorial boundaries. A silver, handled knife was identified as belonging to William Morse, a merchant whose family had searched for him across 3 states. The 3rd skeleton provided the most unsettling confirmation, a distinctive copper cross, described in detail by the family of Robert Chen, a traveling minister who had disappeared while carrying funds for a new church in Tennessee. As each item was cataloged, the scale of Pine Hollow's crimes became undeniable. This was no isolated act of desperation. It was a calculated, years-long campaign of murder and robbery. On the 4th day, Judge Harrison addressed the gathered community. "The evidence before this court is overwhelming. 11 men were murdered along these mountain trails between 1818 and 1820. Their killers used the stolen money to build this settlement, and then murdered the Whitman family to protect their secret." Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry stood shackled before the judge, their faces hollow with the weight of decades-long guilt. At their ages, they would never see freedom again. "The most disturbing aspect of these crimes," the judge continued, "is not their brutality, but their calculated nature. These men did not kill in passion or desperation. They created a systematic method for identifying and murdering travelers, then used their victims' money to construct a community they presented as godly." Pastor Phillips listened with a growing sense of spiritual crisis. Everything he had devoted himself to, church, community, faith, had been built on a foundation of innocent blood. How could he continue to minister in a place so thoroughly corrupted? Yet it was the Morrison twins who offered the most profound insight into the spiritual dimensions of Pine Hollow's sins. "Judge Harrison," Rebecca said, her voice clear and unwavering, "may we speak about forgiveness?" The judge looked down at the 9-year-old girl with a mixture of awe and respect. After 3 days of witnessing, her impossible knowledge had proven accurate in every detail. "Of course, child. What would you like to say?" Rebecca and Rachel stepped forward together beneath the wooden cross, the same one that had presided over 16 years of collective deception, their small forms illuminated by the light streaming through the church windows. "The Whitman sisters want everyone to know they forgive the men who killed them," Rebecca said, her voice steady. "They understand that fear can make people do terrible things." Rachel continued, her tone gentle but firm. "But forgiveness does not erase consequences. The men who committed these crimes must face earthly justice, and the community must find a way to make amends to the families of the victims." Judge Harrison nodded solemnly. "The court agrees. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will face trial for multiple counts of murder and robbery." "But what of the community itself? The church? The other buildings constructed with stolen money?" Ezekiel Morrison spoke, his weathered face thoughtful. "Your Honor, Scripture tells us that the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children. If the next generation chooses righteousness over convenience, this community can still be redeemed, but only through confession, restitution, and genuine repentance." Pastor Phillips found his voice for the first time since the investigation began. The church itself must be reconsecrated, he said firmly. We will remove and properly bury the remains found beneath the floor. We will identify and compensate the victims' families to the extent possible, and we will establish a memorial so these crimes are never forgotten. Solicitor Brennan, who had been documenting every detail, looked up from his notes. The estate of Marcus Webb alone is entitled to significant restitution. His brother has authorized me to pursue full recovery of the stolen funds, plus damages for 16 years of anguish inflicted upon the family. Elder Thompson, despite his shackles and failing health, spoke quietly. The money is gone, he admitted, spent over the years on community improvements, individual families, church maintenance. We have nothing left to give. Judge Harrison's gaze swept over the congregation. Then the community itself bears responsibility. The buildings constructed with stolen funds will be sold. Proceeds will go to the victims' families as partial restitution. Pine Hollow, as it exists, will effectively cease to exist. The crowd reacted as though struck. Families who had spent 16 years building lives here would lose their homes, their church, their entire sense of stability. Children would be uprooted, the elderly displaced, a generation's foundation destroyed by the sins of their leaders. Yet Rebecca Morrison offered one final, chilling revelation. Judge Harrison, she said, her voice carrying an authority beyond her years. There is something else you need to know about Pine Hollow. The church fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through loose boards and the distant rumble of an approaching storm. What do you mean, child? Judge Harrison asked, wary of the answer. Rachel stepped forward, her small hand brushing against her sister's. The mine shaft where some bodies were thrown. It's not just a place where old crimes were hidden. People are still disappearing along these mountain trails. Sheriff Mackenzie straightened. Are you saying these murders are ongoing? Rebecca shook her head slightly. Not the same people. Most of the original killers are too old now. But others learned from their example. The techniques, the locations, the methods. Knowledge like that doesn't die with its creators. The implication rippled through the crowd like ice water. Pine Hollow's crimes had spawned a legacy of violence, claiming victims whose disappearances had long been attributed to the wilderness. Judge Harrison rose, face set with grim determination. Sheriff Mackenzie, we must expand the investigation immediately. If there are more recent crimes connected to this place, we must uncover them all. As legal proceedings moved forward, the Morrison twins stood quietly together, their impossible burden finally lifted. For 3 days, they had served as the voices of the dead, conduits for justice denied, instruments of truth that could no longer be suppressed. Ezekiel Morrison drew his daughters close. Relief and lingering concern etched across his face. Are you ready to leave this place? He asked gently. Rebecca took one last look around the church, her blue eyes tracing the wooden walls, the simple cross, the faces of those forever changed by her testimony. The voices are quieter now, she said softly. Faith and hope can rest. Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. But there will be other places, other voices. Papa? Rebecca asked, voice tinged with wariness. Why do we have to carry all this sadness? Ezekiel knelt to meet his daughter's gaze, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Because, my children, some truths must be carried so that others may finally be free. I don't know, little ones, Ezekiel Morrison said softly, kneeling to meet his daughter's gaze. But I believe God gives special burdens only to those strong enough to bear them. Perhaps your gift, whatever it is, serves a purpose larger than any of us can comprehend. As the Morrison family prepared to leave Pine Hollow, carrying their extraordinary abilities and the terrible knowledge they had uncovered, Pastor Phillips faced the hardest decision of his ministry. Should he stay and help rebuild what could be salvaged from the community's ruins, or abandon a place so steeped in violence and deceit? The answer revealed itself as he watched the twins walking hand in hand beside their father. If 2 9-year-old children could bear the weight of such devastating truth with grace and forgiveness, perhaps hope for redemption could exist, even in the darkest places. 3 weeks later, Pine Hollow had become a ghost town. The church was dismantled board by board, its materials sold to help compensate the victims' families. Residents scattered across Kentucky and Tennessee, carrying the heavy knowledge that their community had been built on innocent blood. But elsewhere, across the region, a new story began to take root, the story of two young girls who possessed knowledge beyond rational explanation, voices for the dead, instruments of long, delayed justice. Some dismissed it as frontier superstition, others saw it as evidence of divine intervention. The Morrison family continued their circuit through remote Appalachian churches, and reports followed them, communities experiencing spiritual renewal, long buried secrets coming to light, mysteries solved by the uncanny insight of twin girls who spoke with the authority of prophets despite their tender years. Judge Harrison's final report on the Pine Hollow investigation spanned 47 pages, chronicling crimes that had lasted more than 2 decades. Its concluding paragraph would be cited in legal texts for generations. This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about justice, truth, and the persistence of moral accountability beyond the grave. While science cannot explain the source of the Morrison children's knowledge, the accuracy of their testimony is indisputable. Some truths are too important to remain buried forever. Pastor Phillips eventually established a new ministry in eastern Tennessee, dedicating his life to helping communities confront difficult truths and pursue genuine redemption. Yet he never forgot those 3 days in Pine Hollow, when 2 9-year-old girls had dismantled 16 years of lies with knowledge no living person should have possessed. The mystery of Rebecca and Rachel Morrison's abilities was never solved. Medical experts of the era had no framework for understanding their insight, and religious authorities remained divided, some seeing divine blessing, others something far more complex. What remained beyond dispute was the historical record. Every detail they revealed about Pine Hollow's crimes proved accurate. Every location they identified yielded evidence exactly as they had described. Every secret they exposed was independently verified. But the most unsettling question was not what they revealed about the past, but what they suggested about justice itself. If the dead cannot rest while their murders remain hidden, if innocence carries power beyond death to demand accountability, then perhaps our understanding of moral consequence extends far beyond earthly life. The Morrison twins vanished from historical records sometime in the 1840s, their fate as mysterious as their abilities. Some say they continued their father's ministry until their deaths, serving as instruments of truth across the American frontier. Others believe they learned to suppress their gift, living quiet, ordinary lives far from the circuit churches where their reputation had been forged. Yet in remote corners of Appalachia, where old secrets fester and ancient crimes remain unpunished, travelers still tell of twin sisters who possess knowledge no living person should have. They speak with the dead as though familiar, reveal truths buried for generations, and remind the guilty that some forms of justice transcend mortal law. Whether these encounters involved the Morrison twins themselves, their spiritual legacy, or something else entirely remains a mystery science cannot solve and faith cannot fully explain. One thing is certain: truth, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed. And sometimes, it finds voices willing to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The files on the Pine Hollow investigation remain in the Kentucky State Archives, available to researchers wishing to verify these extraordinary claims. Judge Harrison's meticulous documentation, Sheriff Mackenzie's evidence reports, and Pastor Phillips's personal journals all corroborate the essential facts. Yet the deeper question, the source of the Morrison twins' impossible knowledge, remains unsolved, as it has since 1834. Some truths are destined to dwell in that shadowland between faith and reason, where the most profound mysteries of existence elude human understanding. Do you believe the Morrison twins truly communicated with the spirits of murder victims? Could their knowledge be explained by natural means we simply do not yet understand? The evidence supports their accuracy, but the source of their abilities remains one of history's most compelling unsolved mysteries. What do you think? Were the Morrison twins instruments of divine justice, or did their insight come from a force beyond human comprehension? Some secrets refuse to stay buried forever, and sometimes the smallest, most innocent voices carry the most devastating truths.